Welcome to the Acura RSX single and double cone synchro measurement guide. We will also inspect the gear and gear sliders. Accurate and correct measurements are important to properly inspect and rebuild a transmission. First, we will go over the proper procedure to measure the single cone synchro. Then we will go over the double cone measurement process. We will also go over the process to inspect the synchro engagement teeth, the gear teeth, and finally we will inspect the gear sliders. Synchro to hub clearance needs to be measured by a feeler gauge. Acura calls for a clearance of 0.7 to 1.49 mm. The service limit is 0.4 mm. If yours is below the service limit, replace the synchro. Acura recommends to replace the hub as well. To begin, twist the synchro until it stops turning to ensure it is seated properly for measurement. Then, place the feeler gauge between the synchro and the gear. We used a 0.88 mm feeler gauge. Your feeler gauge should slide smoothly between the synchro and gear. If it doesn't, use a smaller feeler gauge. Do this for 5th, 4th, and 3rd gear. 2nd and 1st gears have a dual synchro that requires a different procedure for measurement. Now we will measure the 1st and 2nd gear synchro clearances. They both have double cone synchros, which have 3 pieces. This is the top synchro cone with the synchro spring attached. This is the inner ring. It's what both synchro cone friction surfaces ride against. This is the inner cone. It has 2 friction surfaces, one that rides against the inner ring and the other that rides against the gear. There are 3 measurements we need to make with a feeler gauge set. First, between the outer cone and the ring. Second, the clearance between the gear and the inner cone. Last, we will measure the clearance of the outer cone and the gear face. Remove the outer cone and the inner ring. Place the ring inside of the outer cone. Flip the gear over so we can use its hard surface to press the inner ring against while measuring. Twist the ring against the cone to make sure it is properly set for measurement. Grab your feeler gauge set. For this measurement, use one that is angled to make measurement most accurate. Press the cone and ring against the gear while measuring. Insert the feeler gauge between the inner ring and synchro cone. Measure all the way around the inside. For this measurement, Acura calls for a 0.7 to 1.19 mm clearance, so we used a 0.7 mm feeler gauge. The service limit is 0.3 mm, the point at which the part should be replaced. We will now measure the inner cone to gear clearance. Twist the cone against the gear to make sure it is seated properly. Acura calls for a 0.5 to 1.04 mm clearance. The service limit is 0.3 mm. In this video we demonstrate with a 0.35 mm feeler gauge. The synchro set is not worn past the service limit, but it will be replaced. The last part of this measurement procedure is to measure the outer synchro cone to the gear face. This is done with all 3 of the synchro set parts installed onto the gear. Twist the gear set to make sure it's seated properly. Acura calls for a 0.95 to 1.68 mm clearance. The service limit is 0.6 mm. We used a 0.88 mm feeler gauge, as it was the thickest one we have. This is above the service limit, and it was very loose while taking the measurement, so we are confident that the clearance is within spec. We will need to visually check that the gear and synchro's engagement teeth are not rounded off. If they are, the gear or synchro should be replaced. Start with the gear. This gear does have some wear on its teeth, but they still have a sharp enough of an angle to be acceptable. Next, check the synchro's teeth. These also have some wear, but are still acceptable. Even though everything but the cone to gear measurement was within spec, the outer cone, the inner ring, and the inner cone should be replaced. Most rebuild kits, including the Acura part number for this gear set, includes all of these parts. Next, we will need to inspect the gear slider teeth to make sure they are not rounded off. Smooth shifting requires that the engagement teeth of the slider to be at a sharp angle. This should be checked on the 1st to 2nd, 3rd to 4th, and the 5th gear slider. If the teeth are rounded off, the slider should be replaced. Our slider's teeth are still in good condition, so they will be reused. Finally, we will inspect the outer teeth on the 1st to 2nd gear slider. These teeth engage with the reverse idler gear to engage reverse on this transmission. As with the other teeth, make sure they are in good condition. These teeth are showing wear, but they should still work correctly in this transmission. This concludes the measurement procedure required for measuring the synchro clearances on a single cone and a double cone synchro set, as well as inspect the gear sliders on an Acura RSX.